The widow stood at her door watching the dust cloud approach, knowing that feeding hungry cowboys would be the first decision she had made for herself in 3 years. Margaret Grace had been 23 when fever took her husband Samuel during the brutal winter of 1876, and now in the spring of 1879, she found herself staring at opportunity wrapped in leather and sweat. The ranch foreman had sent word that a crew would be passing through Wichita, Kansas on their way north to deliver cattle, and they needed a hot meal before the long push ahead. Margaret had surprised herself by agreeing, though the house had been silent as a tomb since Samuel's death, save for the whisper of wind through cracked window panes and her own footsteps on worn floorboards. She smoothed her hands over her apron, fingers trembling slightly as the riders drew closer. 6 men on horseback materialized from the golden haze of prairie dust, their silhouettes dark against the late afternoon sun. Margaret had spent the entire day preparing, her small kitchen transformed into a flurry of activity for the first time in years. Beef stew simmered in her largest pot, cornbread cooled on the windowsill, and she had even managed to bake 2 apple pies with the preserved fruit she had been hoarding in her cellar. The work had exhausted her, but it had also awakened something inside her chest that felt dangerously close to purpose. The cowboys dismounted with the easy grace of men who lived in their saddles, their boots hitting the hard, packed earth with solid thuds. They were a weathered bunch, their faces lined by sun and hardship, ranging in age from a boy who could not have been more than 19 to a grizzled man whose gray beard spoke of decades on the range. They removed their hats as they approached, a gesture of respect that made Margaret's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Madam, we surely appreciate this," the oldest one said, his voice gravelly but kind. "Name's Dutch Harrison. The foreman said you might be willing to feed us before we head out tomorrow morning." "I prepared plenty," Margaret replied, her own voice sounding strange to her ears. She had spoken so little these past years that conversation felt like a forgotten language. "Please, come inside." They filed in one by one, filling her small home with their presence, the smell of leather and horse and open sky. Margaret busied herself ladling stew into bowls, slicing cornbread, pouring coffee from the pot that had been percolating for the past hour. The men settled around her table, and on chairs dragged in from other rooms, eating with the single-minded focus of those who never knew when their next hot meal might come. She noticed him last, the quiet one who had taken a seat in the corner, farthest from the lamplight. While the others talked and joked, their voices filling the empty spaces of her home with rough laughter, he ate in silence. He was younger than most of the crew, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. When those eyes met hers across the room, Margaret felt something shift beneath her ribs, a sensation she had thought died with Samuel. "Madam, this is the finest meal we have had in 6 months, Dutch declared, raising his coffee cup in salute. "You are a blessing to weary travelers." The others echoed his sentiment, all except the quiet one, who simply nodded once in her direction before returning his attention to his bowl. Margaret found herself wondering about him as she moved through the room, refilling cups and offering second helpings. There was something deliberate about his silence, as though he chose his words carefully and rarely found ones worth speaking. As the evening wore on, the men gradually prepared to leave, thanking her profusely and pressing coins into her hand, despite her protests. They would camp on the outskirts of town tonight and be gone by dawn, pushing their herd north toward better grazing lands in Nebraska. Margaret accepted their payment with quiet dignity, already calculating how much closer, It brought her to affording new chickens for her empty coop. They departed one by one until only the quiet one remained. He stood by her door, hat in his hands, his dark eyes fixed on something just past her shoulder. Margaret waited, her heart beating faster than it should, though she could not have said why. "Thank you for the meal," he said finally, his voice low and rough-edged, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. "It was kindly done." "You are welcome," Margaret replied, cursing the breathlessness in her words. He nodded again, that same economical movement, and then he was gone, leaving only the faint jingle of his spurs fading into the night. Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly aware of how large the silence had become, how it pressed against her from all sides like water. She had survived 3 years in this silence, had learned to move through it like a ghost through walls, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like loneliness. She cleaned her kitchen with methodical efficiency, washing bowls and cups, storing leftover stew, sweeping flour from her floorboards. The coins sat on her table, more money than she had seen in months. It should have made her happy, or at least satisfied, but instead she found herself thinking about dark eyes and careful silence, about the way one man could fill a corner of a room without saying a word. Margaret was banking the fire in her stove when she heard the knock. It was soft, almost apologetic, and for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, and she crossed to her door with her pulse hammering in her throat. The quiet one stood on her porch, his hat still in his hands. "Madam," he said, and then stopped, as though he had run out of words already. "Did you forget something?" Margaret asked, though she could see nothing in his hands but his hat. "No, madam." He shifted his weight, and she realized with some surprise that he was nervous. "I was wondering if you might need any work done around your place. I noticed your fence has some posts leaning, and there's a section of your roof looks like it could use patching." Margaret stared at him, confusion warring with something else she did not want to name. "The crew is leaving tomorrow morning. You said so yourself." "They are," he agreed, "but I do not have to go with them." "Why would you stay here?" The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with 3 years of learning not to trust unexpected kindness. He met her eyes then, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. "Because you made me remember what home feels like, and I have been on the trail for 5 years trying to forget that I miss it." The honesty of it struck her like a physical blow. Margaret had built walls around herself, thick and high, constructed from grief and necessity and the hard lessons of widowhood. But this man with his quiet words and careful eyes had found a crack she did not know existed. "I cannot pay much," she heard herself say. "I do not need much," he replied. "Just supper if you are willing to cook it." "What is your name?" Margaret asked, realizing she had fed him and talked about him in her mind for hours without knowing this most basic thing. "Jacob Anderson, madam. Folks call me Jake." "I am Margaret Grace." "You can call me Margaret if you are going to be staying." He nodded, a ghost of something that might have been a smile touching his mouth. "Margaret, then. I will be back tomorrow evening if that suits you." "That suits me fine," she said, and watched him walk back into the darkness, her heart beating a rhythm she had thought it had forgotten. Sleep came reluctantly that night, her mind too full of questions and possibilities. She had been alone for so long that the thought of another person in her space, even just for meals, felt both terrifying and thrilling. What did she know about Jacob Anderson? He could be anyone, a drifter or a criminal, someone running from the law or from himself. But something in his eyes had seemed honest, and Margaret had learned to trust her instincts about people, even if she no longer trusted much else. She rose with the sun, as she always did, and went about her morning routine with mechanical precision. There were eggs to gather from the few chickens she had left, though they had grown old and contrary and laid only sporadically now. There was bread to bake, though she only ever made small portions for herself. There was water to haul from the well, gardens to tend, endless small tasks that filled her days without ever making them feel full. But today felt different. Today, she found herself glancing at the angle of the sun, calculating hours until evening. Today she made extra bread, mixing the dough with more care than usual. Today she went through her larder and planned a proper meal, not the scraps and leftovers she usually ate standing at her counter. The afternoon stretched long and golden, the Kansas prairie showing off its spring finest. Margaret had always loved this land, even when it tried to kill her with its extremes, its burning summers and brutal winters. She had come here as a bride at 19, following Samuel from Missouri with stars in her eyes and plans in her heart. They were going to build something together, a ranch that would grow and prosper, children who would fill these empty acres with life. But fever had come instead, swift and merciless, and Samuel was buried on the hill behind the house beneath a marker Margaret had carved herself. The ranch plans died with him, the dream children never born. She had survived on vegetables from her garden, on sewing work for the women in town, on slowly selling off the things Samuel had left behind. The cattle went first, then the good horses, then piece by piece anything of value until she was left with this house and the land it sat on and nothing much else. Margaret was peeling potatoes when she saw him coming across the prairie, a lone figure on a sturdy bay horse, leading another horse behind him loaded with supplies. Jacob Anderson arrived as the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, dismounting with that same easy grace she had noticed yesterday. He had tools strapped to his saddle, she saw, and lumber tied to the pack horse. "Evening," he said, removing his hat. "Evening," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "You bought supplies. Figured I should have what I need to do the job proper," he explained. "I noticed yesterday you need more than just fence repair. Your front steps are rotting through and that barn door does not hang right." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I have known for a long time, I just could not fix them myself." "Well, that is what I am here for now." He glanced toward the house, and she saw something almost shy in his expression. "Is it still all right, me staying to do this work?" "It is all right," she confirmed, surprised by how much she meant it. "I am making supper now if you want to wash up at the pump." She watched him tend to his horses first, making sure they had water and grain before he saw to his own comfort. It spoke well of him, that consideration for his animals. Samuel had been the same way, always putting the livestock first because they depended on him in ways another man could not. The meal she had prepared was simpler than yesterday's feast, but she had still put care into it. Fried chicken from one of her older hens who had stopped laying, mashed potatoes with gravy green beans she had preserved last summer, and fresh bread with butter. Jacob sat at her table, the same spot he had occupied yesterday, and ate with quiet appreciation. "You did not have to kill a chicken for me," he said after a while. "She was old and not producing any more," Margaret replied. "It was time." He nodded, accepting this, and they fell into silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Margaret found herself studying him in the lamplight, noting details she had missed yesterday. He had a scar through his left eyebrow, thin and white with age. His hands were scarred too, the marks of hard work and harder living. But they were clean hands, scrubbed carefully at her pump, with short, neat nails and long fingers. "How long have you been on the trail?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. Jacob looked up from his plate, considering her for a long moment before answering. 5 years, near about." Since I was 21. Where are you from originally? Tennessee. My folks had a farm in the eastern part of the state. His voice took on a distant quality, as though he was looking at something far away. My pa died when I was 17. Creek accident, flash flood came through. After that, my ma tried to keep the place going, but it was too much for her. She remarried a year later to a man who did not want another man's son around, even if I was nearly grown. So I left. I am sorry, Margaret said softly, recognizing the pain of loss in his words. It was a long time ago. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes distant. I worked ranches all through Tennessee and Arkansas, learning the trade. Then I signed on with an outfit heading west, and I have been moving ever since. Following work, following herds, never stopping long enough to put down roots. What made you stop now? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Jacob met her eyes again, and she saw that same honesty she had glimpsed last night. I got tired, I guess. Tired of sleeping on the ground. Tired of eating beans from a can. Tired of not having anything that was mine. And then I walked into your house and smelled that stew cooking and saw the way you had set the table with real plates and cups, and I thought, this is what I have been missing. This is what home is supposed to feel like. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She had cried enough in the past 3 years to last a lifetime. I understand tired, she said instead. I have been tired too. How long were you married? He asked gently. 4 years. I was 19 when we wed, 23 when Samuel died. He caught fever during the winter of '76. It took him in less than a week. She twisted her hands in her lap, old grief and new vulnerability tangling together. I thought I would die too those first months after. But I was too stubborn or maybe too afraid. You were brave, Jacob corrected. Staying here alone, keeping this place going, that takes more courage than most people have. I did not feel brave. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything important out of me and left just the shell. Margaret looked down at her plate, surprised by her own candor. She had not talked about Samuel's death with anyone, not really, not like this. And now, Jacob asked quietly. Now I feel like maybe there is something still inside me after all. Something small, like a seed, but alive. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Margaret felt something shift between them, a tentative understanding forming. When Jacob stood to leave, promising to return the next day to start on the repairs, Margaret found herself not wanting him to go. But she said nothing, just walked him to the door and watched him ride off into the darkness, his figure becoming one with the night. He came back the next evening, just as he had promised, and the evening after that, and the one after that. A pattern emerged, comfortable in its predictability. Jacob would arrive in the late afternoon and work until dusk, fixing fence posts or patching the roof or shoring up the barn. Then he would wash at the pump and come inside for supper, and they would eat together and talk in their quiet way, sharing pieces of themselves like offerings. Margaret learned that he had a sister still in Tennessee, married with children now, whom he had not seen in years. She learned that he loved horses more than cattle, that he could read and write because his mother had insisted on it, that he had a weakness for apple pie that made her bake one every few days just to see the pleasure in his eyes. He learned that she had wanted 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls, their names already chosen and written in the margins of her Bible. He learned that she sang while she worked, old hymns mostly, her voice soft and sweet. He learned that she was afraid of storms because lightning had struck near the house once, and the thunder had been so loud she thought the world was ending. Spring deepened into early summer, and the repairs around Margaret's property progressed steadily. The fence stood straight and strong, the roof no longer leaked, The front steps were solid beneath her feet. Jacob worked with quiet competence, never rushing, always thorough. Sometimes Margaret would bring him water or lemonade while he worked, and they would stand together in the shade of the house, not talking, just existing in each other's company. The town had noticed, of course. Wichita was small enough that everyone knew everyone's business, and a young man working at the widow Grace's place did not go unremarked. Margaret heard the whispers when she went to the general store, saw the speculative looks from the other women. Some were kind, hoping she had found happiness again. Others were less generous, suggesting impropriety and questioning her virtue. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, cornered her one afternoon outside the mercantile. She was a large woman with a large opinion of herself, the sort who had appointed herself guardian of the town's morality despite having none herself. "Margaret, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "people are talking about that cowboy who has taken up residence at your place." "He has not taken up residence," Margaret replied evenly. "He is doing repairs in exchange for supper. That is all. Of course, dear, of course. But you must understand how it looks. A young woman alone, a young man coming around every evening. People will draw conclusions." "Let them draw whatever conclusions they like," Margaret said, feeling her spine stiffen. "I know the truth, and that is enough for me." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Pride comes before a fall, Margaret. You would do well to remember that you are a widow and you have a reputation to maintain." "I am a widow, yes," Margaret agreed. "But I am also a woman trying to survive on her own, and if Jacob Anderson's help allows me to keep my home, then I will accept it gratefully and let the gossips say what they will." She walked away before Mrs. Henderson could respond, her hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. She had been quiet for so long, accepting the town's pity and their judgment with equal silence, but something in her had changed. Jacob had changed her, or maybe she had changed herself. Either way, she was tired of being afraid. That evening she told Jacob about the encounter, her words spilling out in a rush. He listened quietly, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "I can stop coming," he said when she finished. "I do not want to cause you trouble." "No," Margaret said fiercely. "I do not want you to stop. I just wanted you to know what people are saying." "I know what people say about drifters and cowboys," Jacob replied. "I have heard it all my life, but I also know who I am, and I know my intentions are honorable." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "Are they causing you real trouble, Margaret? Will they make life harder for you?" "They might," she admitted. "But they have been making life hard for me since Samuel died. At least now I have a reason that feels worth it." Something flickered in his expression, there and gone too fast for her to read. "Worth it," he repeated softly. "Yes," Margaret said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Worth it." The air between them felt charged suddenly, full of unspoken things. Jacob stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and for a wild moment Margaret thought he might reach for her. But instead, he simply picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. "I will see you tomorrow," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow," Margaret agreed and watched him go, her heart pounding against her ribs. Something had shifted again, she realized as she prepared for bed. They had been circling each other for weeks now, careful and cautious, but the circle was growing smaller. She could feel the pull between them, strong as gravity, drawing them closer with each passing day. It frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. She lay in her bed, Samuel's bed, their bed, and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions in her chest. Was it wrong to feel this way about another man? Samuel had been dead for 3 years, and Margaret knew he would not want her to spend the rest of her life alone. But knowing something in your head and feeling it in your heart were two different things. The next evening, Jacob arrived with wildflowers in his hand, prairie roses and black-eyed Susans gathered from the fields. He presented them awkwardly, his ears going red, and Margaret felt her throat close with emotion. "I saw them and thought of you," he said simply. She took them with trembling hands, burying her face in their petals to hide the tears gathering in her eyes. No one had brought her flowers since Samuel's funeral, and those had been funeral flowers, meant for grief. These were different. These were meant for life. "Thank you," she managed. "They are beautiful." She found a jar to put them in, setting them on the table where she could see them while she cooked. Jacob watched her, his expression soft, and Margaret felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed tight for too long. Supper that night was charged with new awareness. Every time their hands brushed in passing, Margaret felt electricity run up her arm. Every time their eyes met, she saw heat and hunger and hope reflected back at her. They were dancing around something inevitable now, and both of them knew it. After they ate, Jacob did not immediately rise to leave. Instead, he stayed at the table, his coffee cup cradled in his hands, his eyes on her face. "Margaret," he said, and then stopped, seeming to gather his courage. "I need to tell you something." Her heart kicked into a gallop. "All right. I did not just stop here for work. I stopped because of you." The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back for too long. "That first night when you fed us all, I looked at you and something in my chest just settled. Like I had been wandering lost for years and suddenly found north. And every night since, I come back here and I sit at your table and I think, this is where I am supposed to be. This is home." Margaret could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at him with her heart in her throat. "I know I have nothing to offer you," Jacob continued. "I have no land, no money, nothing but these 2 hands and a horse and whatever work I can find. I know you were married before to a man who could provide for you, and I am just a cowboy who has been drifting most of his life. But I am asking anyway because I cannot keep pretending I do not feel what I feel." "What do you feel?" Margaret whispered. "I love you," Jacob said, simple and direct, his eyes never leaving hers. "I have loved you since that first night, and it has been growing stronger every day. I love the way you hum while you cook, and the way you stand on your porch in the morning watching the sun come up. I love your strength and your stubborn independence and the softness you try to hide. I love all of you, Margaret, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down her face in rivers. Margaret had thought herself cried out, had thought she had no tears left, but here they were, falling like rain. But these were not tears of grief. These were tears of relief and joy and overwhelming emotion. "I do not know how to do this again," she said, her voice breaking. "I do not know how to let someone in when I am still so afraid of losing them." Jacob rose from his chair and crossed to her, kneeling beside her so they were at eye level. He took her hands in his calloused fingers warm and strong. "I cannot promise I will never leave you," he said honestly. "Life makes no guarantees and death comes for everyone eventually, but I can promise that as long as I draw breath, I will choose you. Every single day I will choose you. And that is all any of us can promise." Margaret looked into his dark eyes, seeing the truth there, seeing the love he had just declared reflected back at her. She thought of Samuel, buried on the hill, and sent up a silent prayer asking forgiveness and blessing both. And then she leaned forward and kissed Jacob Anderson, softly at first and then deeper, tasting coffee and hope and the future. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "That is a yes," Margaret confirmed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I love you. Yes, I want this. Yes to all of it." They sat together on the floor of her kitchen, holding each other as the lamp burned low and the night deepened around them. Margaret felt lighter than she had in years, as though some great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had been so alone for so long, and now she was not, and the relief of it made her giddy. "We should do this properly," Jacob said eventually. "I should court you right, let the town see that my intentions are honorable." "The town already has opinions," Margaret pointed out. "But yes, I would like that. I would like to be courted." So they courted in the old-fashioned way, with Sunday walks and picnics by the creek, and Jacob sitting on her porch in the evenings playing his harmonica while she darned socks. The gossip intensified, but so did Margaret's happiness, and she found she cared less and less what Mrs. Henderson and her ilk thought. Jacob made her laugh with his dry humor and his observations about ranch life. He brought her small gifts, a ribbon from the mercantile, a book of poetry he had saved up to buy. He was patient with her fears and her occasional moments of grief, understanding that loving him did not mean forgetting Samuel. In July, Jacob took her to the 4th of July celebration in town, and they danced together for the first time under strings of lanterns and stars. Margaret wore her best dress, a blue calico she had not worn since before Samuel's death, and Jacob had bought a new shirt for the occasion. They moved together easily, naturally, as though they had been dancing together for years instead of months. "People are staring," Margaret murmured as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Let them stare," Jacob replied. "I am dancing with the most beautiful woman in Kansas. Let them be jealous." She laughed and buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, soap and leather and the faint smell of horses that never quite washed out. She felt safe in his arms, cherished, and it was a feeling she had thought she might never experience again. Later, as they walked home under the vast prairie sky, Jacob took her hand and held it, their fingers interlaced. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. "I have been saving my wages," he said quietly. "From the work I have been doing for the ranchers around here, I have almost enough to buy some cattle, start a small herd." Margaret's heart leaped. "You are staying then? For good? If you will have me, I am never leaving." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I want to build a life here, Margaret. With you, if you will let me. I want to expand your ranch, build it back up to what you and Samuel dreamed of. I want to fill that house with the children you wanted. I want to grow old on this land, watching our grandchildren play in those fields." "That is a lot of wanting," Margaret said, her voice shaky. "It is," he agreed. "Too much." "No," she whispered. "Not too much, just exactly enough." He kissed her then, deep and slow, pouring everything he felt into it. When they broke apart, Margaret was dizzy with happiness and desire and 1,000 unnamed emotions. "Will you marry me, Margaret Grace?" Jacob asked, his voice low and intense. "Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Jacob Anderson, I will marry you." They were wed in August in the small church on the edge of town with the preacher and a handful of witnesses. Margaret wore a new dress made of cream-colored cotton, and Jacob wore his new shirt and had gotten a haircut for the occasion. Margaret's friend Sarah stood up with her, and Dutch Harrison, who had been part of that original crew of Cowboys, stood up with Jake, having stayed in the area working for one of the larger ranches. Mrs. Henderson did not attend, but enough people did that the small church felt full. The ceremony was simple and brief, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed Margaret with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance sighed audibly. They held a small reception at the house, with cake that Sarah had baked and lemonade and music from Dutch's fiddle. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, their guests gradually departed, leaving Jacob and Margaret alone for the first time as husband and wife. Margaret stood on her porch, their porch now, watching the last wagon disappear down the road. Jacob came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "More than I thought possible," Margaret admitted. "I thought I was done with happiness. I thought I had used up my share." "Maybe we get more than one share," Jacob suggested. "Maybe we get as much as we are willing to reach for." She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the scar through his eyebrow with her fingertip. "I am glad you came back that first night. I am glad you kept coming back. I will always come back to you," he promised. "No matter where I go or what I am doing, I will always find my way home to you." They went inside together, closing the door on the world, and Margaret felt the last of her walls crumble away. She had protected herself for so long, had wrapped her heart in armor to keep it safe, but there was no safety in isolation. There was only loneliness. Real safety came from being known and loved anyway, from trusting someone else with all your broken pieces and letting them help you put them back together. That night, in the bed she had once shared with Samuel, Margaret gave herself to Jacob completely, holding nothing back. And in the giving, she found herself made whole again, transformed from widow to wife, from alone to beloved. They moved together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies, creating new memories to overlay the old. Afterward, lying tangled in the sheets with Jacob's arm around her and her head on his chest, Margaret listened to the steady beat of his heart and felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I am going to love you every day for the rest of our lives." And he did. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good, filled with the kind of happiness that comes from hard work and deep commitment. Jacob bought his cattle, 10 head to start, and slowly built them into a thriving herd. He expanded the barn and fixed the fences and proved himself to be as good a rancher as he was a cowboy. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in October, and the joy of it nearly overwhelmed her. She had thought this dream was dead, buried with Samuel, but here it was blooming inside her, new life and new hope. Jacob was over the moon, fussing over her like she was made of glass, driving her crazy with his constant concern. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him exasperatedly when he tried to insist she stop hauling water. "I know that," he replied, "but you are carrying my child and I will be protective if I want to be." Their son was born in June of 1880, a healthy baby boy with dark hair like his father and lungs that could wake the dead. They named him Samuel Jacob, honoring the past while celebrating the future. Margaret had worried that having a baby would bring back too much grief, too many memories of the children she had planned with her first husband, but instead it felt like healing. She could love this child completely while still honoring Samuel's memory, could give Jacob a family without betraying her past. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with baby Samuel at night so Margaret could sleep, changing diapers without complaint, staring at his son with such wonder that it made Margaret's heart ache. Watching him with their baby, she fell in love with him all over again, deeper than before. The ranch prospered. By 1882 they had expanded their herd to 50 head, and Jacob had hired a young cowhand named Tom to help with the work. Margaret's garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could eat, so she started selling the excess in town. They were building something real and lasting, exactly what she and Samuel had dreamed of, but with Jacob instead. Sometimes Margaret felt guilty about that, about taking Samuel's dreams and making them reality with another man. But Sarah, who had become her closest confidante, told her she was being ridiculous. Samuel would want you to be happy, Sarah said firmly. He loved you. He would want you to live, not spend your whole life mourning him. Margaret knew she was right. And as time passed, the guilt faded, replaced by gratitude. She had been blessed twice, loved by two good men, and that was nothing to feel guilty about. Their daughter was born in 1883, a tiny girl with her mother's green eyes and a disposition as sweet as honey. They named her Rose Elizabeth, and Samuel adored his baby sister with fierce devotion. The house that had been so silent for so long was now filled with laughter and crying and the chaotic noise of family life, and Margaret would not have traded it for anything. Jake expanded their holdings, buying the adjoining property when the owner decided to move back east. They hired more help, built a bigger barn, added rooms onto the house to accommodate their growing family. The ranch became known for producing quality cattle, and Jacob's reputation as a fair and honest rancher spread throughout the region. In 1885, Margaret gave birth to twin boys, William and Thomas, and their house became even more chaotic and joyful. Jake built onto the house again, adding a whole wing for the children, and Margaret spent her days in happy exhaustion, cooking and cleaning and raising 4 children while still helping with the ranch work when she could. The years blurred together in the way they do when life is full and busy and good. Samuel grew tall and strong, taking after his father, learning to ride and rope, and everything a rancher needed to know. Rose was gentle and kind, with a gift for gentling horses and a voice that could sing like an angel. The twins were wild and reckless, keeping everyone on their toes with their adventures and mischief. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake took Margaret to the creek where they had picnicked during their courtship. The children were home with Sarah, and they had the evening to themselves, a rare luxury. "You remember that 4th of July dance?" Jake asked, pulling her into his arms and swaying to music only they could hear. "I remember everything," Margaret replied, smiling up at him. "I remember being terrified and thrilled and thinking I had no right to be that happy. And now?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they did when he smiled. "Now I know I had every right," she said firmly. "Now I know that happiness is not something you earn or deserve. It is something you choose every single day." "I choose you," Jake murmured, echoing the words he had spoken 10 years ago in her kitchen. "Every day I choose you." "And I choose you," Margaret replied, kissing him softly. "Every day for the rest of my life." They stayed by the creek until the stars came out, talking and laughing and remembering all the moments that had brought them here. Margaret thought about the widow she had been, hollow and grieving and barely surviving, and marveled at the woman she had become, full of life and love and purpose. In 1887, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise baby that made her laugh with delight despite being exhausted from raising 4 children. Their last child, another daughter, was born in early 1888, and they named her Grace, after Margaret's maiden name. She was a tiny thing, smaller than the others had been, but with a will of iron and a personality that could light up a room. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and the years accumulated like precious jewels. Samuel married Sarah's daughter in 1895, bringing his young bride to live on the ranch and promising to take over operations as Jake got older. Rose married a schoolteacher from town and moved to Topeka, though she visited often and wrote weekly letters. The twins, inseparable as always, decided to strike out on their own, heading to Wyoming to start their own ranch, though they promised to come home for Christmas every year. Grace, their youngest, stayed home the longest, helping Margaret with the house and garden and proving herself as capable as any of her brothers at ranch work. She did not marry until she was 24, wedding a neighboring rancher's son in a ceremony that brought half the county to the ranch. Jake and Margaret watched their children build their own lives, becoming grandparents and then great-grandparents, their house always full of visiting family and the sound of children's laughter. They grew old together, Jake's hair turning silver and Margaret's face lining with age, but the love between them never dimmed. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a massive party, with family coming from all over Kansas and beyond. The ranch they had built together was now one of the largest and most successful in the region, and their descendants numbered in the dozens. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and only family remained, Jake found Margaret standing on the porch where he had first proposed, looking out over the land they had built together. "Tired?" he asked, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Pleasantly," Margaret replied, leaning into him. "It was a beautiful day." "It was," he agreed, "just like all our days have been beautiful." Margaret turned to look at him, this man who had walked into her life 21 years after she was born, when she had thought her life was over. He had gray in his hair now and lines on his face, but his eyes were still the same, dark and warm and full of love. "You remember what you said to me that second night?" she asked. "When you showed up at my door and asked if I had work that needed doing." "I said a lot of things that night," Jake replied with a smile. "You said I made you remember what home feels like," Margaret reminded him. "You said you had been trying to forget you missed it." "I remember," he said softly. "You gave me a home too," Margaret told him, her voice thick with emotion. "Not this house, not this ranch, but home in you. You gave me a reason to keep living when I thought there was no reason left. You gave me love and family and 40 years of happiness I never thought I would have." "Margaret," Jake said, his own voice rough, "you saved me just as much as I saved you. Maybe more. I was lost before I found you, drifting and empty and looking for something I could not name. And then I walked into your house and there you were, and I finally knew what I had been looking for my whole life." They stood together on the porch, holding each other as the sun set over the prairie they loved, over the land they had built into something lasting and good. Around them, they could hear their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the family they had created together, the legacy they would leave behind. "I love you," Margaret whispered. "I love you too," Jake replied, "until my last breath and beyond." And they did love each other, right up until Jake passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, with Margaret holding his hand and their children gathered around his bed. Margaret grieved him, as she had grieved Samuel before him, but this grief was different. It was not the hollow, empty grief of her youth, but something fuller, richer, woven through with gratitude for every year they had shared. She lived 5 more years after Jake's passing, spending her days surrounded by family, telling stories about her 2 husbands and the life she had built. She spoke of Samuel with love and respect, honoring the young man who had been her first love and her first loss. And she spoke of Jake with joy and gratitude, celebrating the man who had taught her that hearts can heal and love can come more than once. On a spring morning in 1924, Margaret Grace Anderson passed away in her sleep at the age of 91, in the bed she had shared with both her husbands, in the house that had seen so much life and love. Her children buried her on the hill behind the house, between Samuel's grave and Jake's, and on her marker they inscribed the words she had requested. "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she loved deeply, twice, and lived fully." The ranch continued for generations, passed down through Samuel's children and their children after that, a lasting testament to what 2 people could build when they chose love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over loneliness. And every spring, Wildflowers would bloom on that hill where three graves stood together, prairie roses and black-eyed Susans that seemed to grow nowhere else on the property, as though the land itself remembered the love story that had unfolded there. In the end, Margaret's story was not one of loss, though loss had shaped her. It was a story of resilience and second chances, of a widow who dared to open her heart again, and a cowboy who chose to stay when he could have kept drifting. It was a story of one meal that became a lifetime of meals, of one quiet man who returned every night until a grieving woman understood that love was not a finite resource but an infinite one, capable of expanding to hold both memory and hope, past and future, grief and joy all at once. And somewhere in heaven, or wherever the souls of good men go, Samuel Grace and Jacob Anderson looked down on the family they had both helped create and smiled, knowing that love, real love, never dies but simply transforms, passing from one generation to the next like a torch in the darkness, lighting the way home.